Greetings to all. It is my distinct pleasure to warmly welcome all of you as we begin today's session on the theme of Russia and its influence operations, organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. I'm Kamakshi Wason, Global Chief Operating Officer and Director of Academic Programs at the Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation is a global think tank working in the areas of international relations, diplomacy, area studies, gender, environmental, financial, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. At the outset, let me request everyone to observe a moment of silence to honor our major patron, Mrs. Anita Datta, who recently passed away. A former headmistress and teacher, she selflessly devoted her life to help others and emphasized the importance of education in empowering individuals and transforming society. Thank you. Now, let me express my gratitude to Mr. Sohan Das, Chairperson and Director at the Tillotoma Foundation, for his relentless support and vital role in curating this session. At the Tillotoma Foundation, we prioritize diversity, gender equality, sustainability, and being impartial in all our endeavors. I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Thomas Kent, Adjunct Associate Professor, the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, former President and CEO, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and a leading expert on Russia and counter-disinformation strategy. His recent book, titled How Russia Loses, Hubris and Miscalculation in Putin's Kremlin, offers invaluable insight into understanding Russian influence operations. Professor Kent's extensive research and expertise in the field of Russia and counter-disinformation strategies are invaluable to our understanding of the complex dynamics and challenges associated with the topic. Eurasia is an area of great geopolitical significance, and Russia's influence operations have the potential to shape regional and global power dynamics. The Eurasian region has been a crucial focus area of the Foundation. Over the years, the Foundation has actively cooperated with and worked with institutions, senior experts, and diplomats from the Eurasian region. Several track-to diplomatic conclaves, international seminars with high-level participation, and lecture series have been organized by the Tillotoma Foundation on this area. In today's discussion, we will delve into the various ways in which Russia's influence operations have impacted global affairs, exploring the strategies employed and their implications for international relations. We will also explore the factors that shape Russia's influence and the consequences of their actions on the global stage. To fully understand these dynamics, a multidisciplinary approach to studying the topic is very crucial. Key questions to consider in our today's session are: number one, what are the key strategies employed by Russia in its influence operations? How do these strategies impact global affairs and international relations? What are the consequences of Russia's influence operations on the global stage? What research methodology can best capture and analyze Russia's influence operations? How are some countries and organizations effectively countering or can counter Russia's influence operations and mitigate their impact? What lessons can be learned from past instances of successful counter-disinformation strategies against Russia? What role do technology and social media platforms play in amplifying Russia's influence operations? I'm sure our distinguished speaker for today will address these questions and shed some light on the complexity of Russia's influence operations and their implications for global affairs. Thank you so much, Professor Kent, for joining us today. I now cordially invite Professor Kent to commence the special address. Over to you, Professor Kent.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wason, and good morning, everyone from New York, where the sun has been up for only a couple hours now. In writing this book, I proceeded from the fact that in many people's view, Kremlin information operations have been pretty much unbeatable. Their success rate has certainly been substantial, Their influence around the Ukraine war is increasingly effective. But part of the power of Kremlin influence is that people believe its influence is all powerful. We tend to overlook the fact that some Russian influence operations under Putin have met with short-term or long-term failures. So what do I mean by Russian influence operations? Basically, I mean efforts to induce nations and populations to hold attitudes and to carry out policies that serve Russia's geopolitical or economic interests. And that can range from nation capture, where Russia tries to make a country compliant with Russian policy in every way, making it essentially a client state, or it can be a much more limited influence campaign to support a specific immediate Russian goal in one country or one region. Influence operations can also include Russian efforts to, for example, during the Ukraine war, to convince countries to, well, just not think about something. Regarding Ukraine, the Russian message to other countries is that Ukraine is a long way from you. So just keep trading with us and pay no attention. There are no implications here for other nations' security or yours. That's the Russian message. If anyone in these countries expresses concern for the principles of sovereignty or territorial integrity, which most countries care about regarding their own territory, India certainly does, Russia answers with this cocktail of slogans about anti-colonialism and Western malfeasance and hopes people are satisfied with that. Russia has made some progress with its influence. So it's a bit counterintuitive when some chips are falling the Kremlin way to publish a book about weaknesses in their influence efforts. But that makes it perhaps more important to focus on the kinds of miscalculations that they do make and how these societies that still care about sovereignty and basic political and human rights can incorporate this knowledge into their tactics in what will still be a long game of influence. And indeed, in a number of places, we have seen Russia's influence efforts exposed and resisted. We've seen its allies defeated, its power insufficient, and its political calculations upended. And these things happened because of governments that acted vigorously to block Russia at critical moments, because of journalists and civil society activists who took action against corruption and autocracy, because of Russian economic weakness, and because of Russia's own conflicting goals. My methodology was to look systematically at a small set of such cases to see what similarities there might be among them. And I sought to determine if Russia tends to make the same kinds of miscalculations again and again. And also, what forces and what institutions have served as obstacles to Russian influence that merit reinforcement in the future. I did this mainly through historical research and interviews with time on the ground in most of the countries involved. It was a 2-year project and pretty mind-expanding. I had to get into the scientific differences among different COVID vaccines, the layout of European gas pipelines, the number of gigawatts of electricity that a typical Russian nuclear plant produces, and other forms of, well, applied political science. I traveled to 10 countries. I did 10,000 interviews by Zoom. Well, at least it seems like 10,000. All in all, it was a pretty fascinating exploration. And the resulting book is available now from the usual online sources, but it's also available as a free download from the Jamestown Foundation website because we wanted to make the book as widely available as possible. The book is structured as 6 case studies, followed by a chapter synthesizing the reasons for Russian setbacks that manifested themselves from case to case. And finally, at the end, there's a chapter saying what lessons there are in these setbacks for tacticians in countries that have to deal with Russian influence operations. So I'm going to try very briefly to summarize the cases that I studied, just to give you an idea of the geographical and subject spread. And after I run through them, I'll try to synthesize what together they teach in terms of weaknesses in Russian influence operations. The first case is Ukraine. It's not about the invasion of Ukraine, but about how Vladimir Putin managed in more than 20 years as the undisputed head of Russia and Russian foreign policy to get to the point where he felt he had no option but to invade Ukraine. John Herbst, who addressed the Tillotoma conference in Washington in 2021, told me that when he became U.S. ambassador to Ukraine in 2003, Putin was the most popular politician in the country. Ukraine was Putin's to lose, and he lost it. Putin was clearly alarmed every time Ukraine built some bridge to the west, but for decades, Ukraine did so very fitfully and always aware of Russia's importance and power. Various Ukrainian governments over time did make some moves toward NATO membership, but subsequent governments then turned back from that. Despite Western nations' occasional efforts to build influence in Ukraine, Ukrainian citizens overall did not support a military alliance with the West. In the summer of 2013, just before Maidan and the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, more Ukrainians considered NATO a threat to peace than a source of protection. So, given many Ukrainians' wary view of NATO and the West in general, and all of Ukraine's deep connections with Russia, there was certainly something to work with. And he talked at various points, kind of wistfully, about how Ukraine's relations with Russia could be like Canada's relations with the US or Germany's relations with Austria. But again and again, he missed or ignored opportunities to build a good neighbor relationship. There were misunderstandings, arrogance, trade disputes, political confrontations, all played their role and led to ultimately to the catastrophe that we see today. The second case study in the book is about South Africa, which is another place where Russia came in with commanding initial advantage. When the new multiracial South Africa was proclaimed in 1994, led by Nelson Mandela, Russia, or at least its Soviet predecessor, was a hero in that country. And in 2009, Russia got a huge additional boost with Jacob Zuma, who had worked closely with Russian advisors. Zuma and his African National Party were very enthusiastic backers of Moscow. So everything looked perfect for long-term Russian friendship with South Africa. Unfortunately, the Zuma regime turned out to be famous for its level of corruption. And probably the final nail in the coffin of the Zuma presidency was ironically hammered in by Putin. The mechanism for this was a truly spectacular deal devised personally by Zuma and Putin for the purchase of Russian nuclear power plants by South Africa. It certainly would have created electric power, but the financial nature of this deal was stunning. By various estimates, South African citizens would have had to pay Russia by as much as $125 billion, which is an astronomical amount for South Africa. $125 billion was the entire government budget in 2015. The deal had all the ingredients to make South Africa an economic vassal of Russia in perpetuity, always dependent on Russia to restructure this enormous debt. Zuma said not to worry, that Russia would always take care of South Africa. And Zuma said, I thought this was interesting, Zuma said the deal was a way of rewarding the Putin government for Soviet support of the ANC during the anti-apartheid struggle. Now, it's not intuitive to me that a country with millions of impoverished residents should financially reward a resource-rich superpower, but the comment reflected the depth of Zuma's commitment to Russia. In any case, South African journalists, civil society, environmental groups all rallied against the project, which became the biggest focus of opposition to the Zuma government. Opponents fought the deal in court, got it stopped in April 2017, and Zuma resigned less than a year later. The whole affair tarnished Russian-South African relations quite broadly, as well as Putin's own image in South Africa. A Russian commentator pointed at the time to what he called overall negative feelings about Zuma that carried over onto our country and its president. As we know, South Africa is once again quite close to Moscow, which makes an important point for the book that some Russian influence losses are indeed temporary. But I found it instructive to look at what did go wrong in Russian strategy there that led to the plunge in relations with South Africa with Zuma's resignation, a moment that other nations might have been able to leverage for their benefit if they had seized on it. The third example in the book is the Sputnik COVID vaccine. In August of 2020, Russia became the first country to grant official approval for a vaccine against COVID. And Russia announced that Sputnik would soon be available worldwide. At this point, COVID had killed 800,000 people in the world. Western scientists were warning that a vaccine could be a year and a half away. And this Russian vaccine had all the potential of the Sputnik satellite in 1957, a scientific achievement that could bring Russia international glory and leave Western countries and their scientists humiliated. And within days, Sputnik's makers announced that countries around the world had ordered 1 billion doses. Now, this led to two kinds of panic in Western countries. Part of the concern was political. Politicians thought it was fine to save lives, but they were not really enthusiastic about Russia doing this. Russia might well convert Sputnik, they thought, into a geopolitical victory. For example, it might offer Sputnik only to countries if they agreed to remove any sanctions against Russia. On another level, scientists were alarmed. If this vaccine that had clearly been rushed out turned out to be ineffective or produce serious side effects, it could drive up fear of any COVID vaccine worldwide, leading people to avoid better vaccines in the future. Well, Sputnik began to be distributed, and it seemed to work. At least it didn't kill anybody that we know of. And for a while, it looked pretty good for Russia. Russia did deals with dozens of countries in the Mideast, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Putin said that the Sputnik business could be worth $100 billion to Russia. And Sputnik even made some inroads in the EU. Hungary and Slovakia started using it, and pro-Russian politicians in Italy and France said, "What are we waiting for? We need to adopt this as quickly as possible." So how did it all come out in the end? In Europe, Russia never produced the data for the European Medicines Agency to show by scientific standards that Sputnik was truly safe and effective, so it was never approved for EU use. Also, Russia never convinced the World Health Organization of the scientific merits of Sputnik, so it was never included in the COVAX system that provides vaccines to the world's neediest nations. And then for countries that it had done deals with, Russia couldn't produce what it promised. Dozens of countries that told their citizens that Russia would save them were left with angry populations waiting for shots. China massively outproduced Russia with its own vaccines, though it turned out that their protection was not always long-lasting. Finally, in the second half of 2021, Western vaccines began to arrive in quantity worldwide, and they soon became the world standard. As you know, India played a big role in this, producing big quantities of Covishield, which was the Indian version of the AstraZeneca vaccine, plus India produced its own Covaxin. To give you an idea of the scale of production, by May 2022, Russia had produced a cumulative total of just over 33 million doses of Sputnik, 33 million. By comparison, China had produced 600 million doses of its vaccines, the US and the EU 630 million, and India 250 million doses compared to 33 million in Russia. So despite all the effort that Russia put into Sputnik, by mid-2022, fewer than 2% of all COVID vaccines produced in the world had come from Russia. Russia had positioned its vaccine above all as a savior for the global South. But ultimately, Sputnik accounted for fewer than half of 1% of all COVID vaccines administered in Africa. Despite all of Russia's promotion of Sputnik and all the worries it generated, the Russian vaccine became essentially a statistical footnote. The fourth case study in my book is about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Very few projects promised Russia as much geopolitical advantage as this pipeline, which would run directly from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea and would further cement Europe's energy dependence on the Kremlin. With the support of Angela Merkel and Europe's largest energy companies, Nord Stream 2's construction managed to move forward for a decade, largely insulated from other tensions between Russia and the West. But eventually, Nord Stream 2's political invulnerability began to fade. Little Denmark, a NATO member, held up completion of the pipeline for more than 2 years before it granted approval of its route through Danish waters. The US imposed sanctions on the Swiss company laying the pipe. Public opinion across Europe strongly swung against Russia because of its aggressive behavior at home and abroad, including the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny and Russia's constant threats against Ukraine. In fact, Nord Stream 2 was largely an anti-Ukraine project. It was designed basically to get Western companies to provide the financing to get the same gas from Russia that they were already getting, but in a way that would satisfy Russia's need to bypass Ukraine. The US sanctions and Danish delays had a devastating impact on Nord Stream 2. By the time it was completed in 2021, 2 years behind schedule, Germany's government coalition had changed. Merkel, the pipeline's great defender, was out, and the Green Party, which opposed the pipeline, had won key ministries that gave them control of foreign affairs and environmental and energy issues. At the same time, German and European regulators were tying a legal web around the pipeline. They imposed new regulations that drew Gazprom, the Russian pipeline owner, into a legal and bureaucratic nightmare. More legal trouble waited in the wings from East European nations opposed to the project, especially Poland. So finally, on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the new German government canceled an essential permit for Nord Stream 2, which all but sealed the fate of this mega 10 billion euro project, which now lies literally dead in the water and somewhat blown apart as well after the explosions in September of last year. Then I had the case study of the very sharp, very intense conflict between Russia and the West in the nation of Macedonia in 2017 and 2018. Not a lot of people recall this affair, but for a very brief time, Macedonia became one of the liveliest places geopolitically on Earth. The center of the conflict was a proposal that Macedonia change its name. Greece had demanded this to allow Macedonia into NATO and the EU. In Greece's view, only its own Macedonian region has the right to call itself Macedonia. Macedonia's government finally reached an agreement with Greece to change its name to North Macedonia. But this required a vote to change Macedonia's constitution. And this touched off a major battle of influence in Macedonia, a country with fewer than 2 million people and the lowest media literacy rate in Europe. On one side were the EU and NATO, which campaigned heavily for Macedonians to accept the name change so it could join the two organizations. On the other side were Macedonian nationalists backed by Russia, who strongly opposed it. Western nations financed a huge social media campaign to support the name change. Everybody came to Macedonia. Angela Merkel, Theresa May, the NATO Secretary General, and the US Defense Secretary, they all arrived in Macedonia as part of the effort to seal Macedonia into the Western camp. One wonders, before they came, how many of them could have found Macedonia on a map. The opponents of the name change unrolled their own big campaign. Russia dispatched Alexander Dugin, the radical pan-Slavists close to Putin to whip up anti-Western audiences. The Russian ambassador warned that if Macedonia joined NATO, it would make itself a target for nuclear attack. And through it all, both Russia and Western countries insisted, with straight faces, that they were in no way trying to intervene in a free choice by the Macedonian people. The matter finally wound up in the National Assembly, where the pro-Western forces needed to swing about 15 votes, and they did, with a good deal of arm twisting. Russia claimed the US and its Macedonian allies were manipulating the assembly members by all sorts of promises and intimidation. The US denied it. The Macedonian government denied it. In the end, a pretty outraged Russia found itself the loser in the kind of hard-knuckles influence effort it's supposed to be so good at. My final case study is about Ecuador under the leadership of Rafael Correa, who became president in 2007. Correa was a fervent leftist. He saw the US as the main oppressor of Latin America and Russia as a supporter and ally. He visited Russian presidents in Moscow twice. He shut down a US base in Ecuador. He expelled the US ambassador. He expelled USAID. He forged strong relations with China and even Iran. He granted asylum at Ecuador's embassy in London to Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, whom the US was desperate to arrest. Everything he did seemed to serve Russian interests and to antagonize the United States. Yet Correa's government, like Zuma, was a constant target of charges of corruption. He was increasingly opposed by civil society, journalists, and powerful labor and indigenous organizations. Eventually, he decided not to run again, apparently for fear of defeat. And the new president in 2017 totally reversed course. He restored relations with Washington. He expelled Assange from the embassy in London. He allowed US aircraft to operate again from Ecuador. In the words of the Russian ambassador, Russia's relations with Ecuador froze. So, 6 very disparate cases of Russian influence gone wrong. What did I find in these stories that ties them together and offers lessons for the future? Well, first I found that Russia tends to yoke its fortunes to narrow political and business elites in countries it wants to influence. Of course, every country tries to ingratiate itself with another nation's leaders, but this seems to be Russia's main strategy. When those leaders collapse, as did Yanukovych in Ukraine before as a part of the Maidan Revolution, or Correa in Ecuador, and Zuma in South Africa, Russian influence can evaporate. Often, their strength ends, their regimes collapse because of corruption. This is another very common element. And so when Russia influence evaporates, Russia also sometimes finds that these elites have a purely transactional view of their relationship with Russia. Sometimes there's no love, only interests. Many people believe, for example, that Correa cozied up to Russia only to the degree it could help him domestically and build his leftist profile as a Latin American leftist leader. He never gave Russia full diplomatic backing at the UN, never bought military equipment or other things that Russia wanted. So regimes collapsing and leaving Russia in the lurch, and even when they are in power, sometimes having just a transactional relationship with Russia. I could also see across these cases that Russia focuses on advantages to itself. There's not a lot of altruism in Russian foreign policy. The Kremlin's apparent vision for Macedonia was for it to never enter NATO and the EU, and perpetually be at odds with its neighbors, adding to general turmoil in the Balkans. Russia fueled Correa's anti-American positions while knowing it could never offer Ecuador a real alternative to its economic dependence on the United States. Moscow's intent for South Africa seemed to be for it to be eternally dependent on Russia, always having to beg Russia to restructure an enormous debt. Even in the case of life-saving Sputnik, Russia positioned it almost entirely as a product to be sold, not donated. I found that Russia pays very little attention to people-to-people relationships and to foreign aid. Russia far prefers making deals with a country's elite to the harder and more expensive task of winning favor with local populations. Working with local populations comes naturally to many nations that give foreign aid, but it's pretty alien to Russian strategy for accomplishing its goals. Not only does Russia have very little money for foreign aid, but people-to-people projects seem far from its DNA. Everyone in South Africa knew how much the US did to help cope with the huge AIDS epidemic there. In Macedonia, one expert I talked to compared Western and Russian aid in that country as a relationship between a tank and a Lada, the tiny little Russian compact car. That said, I don't underestimate the power of Russian propaganda. Russia is great at exploiting grievance and turning people against Western countries. It's appropriated terms like anti-colonialism from countries that really know about colonialism to posture as their best friend. At the same time, though, Russia offers no model of prosperity, no strategy to help the people of a target country with their actual problems. It focuses on benefits to itself in each country it deals with, while offering the people in that country very little more than anti-Western rage. I must say Russia is good at this, but the obvious disconnect in what Russia offers opens a door for pro-democracy, pro-free market communication if market societies, free societies, choose to seize that advantage. Western countries, though, are often very shy to compete in the information domain, something we can talk about later if you like, meaning that the pretty empty slogans that Russia offers are often left to spread without being challenged. From case to case, I found Russia's economic weakness to be a significant obstacle to its influence. Russia claimed it could supply the Sputnik vaccine to 700 million people in 2021. It supplied nothing like that amount. Despite all its verbal solidarity with South Africa, its economic ties and investment there were minimal. In Zuma's last year in power, South Africa's top trading partners were China, Germany, the United States, and India. Russia ranked 38th, accounting for about 0.5% of South African imports and exports. Even with Ecuador, Russia ran a permanent trade deficit. All of Russia seemed unable to come up with any products that were attractive enough to Ecuadorians to balance the value of the roses and bananas that Ecuador was shipping to Russia. I found Russia routinely underestimates the strength of democratic institutions and civil society. South Africa's civil society and judiciary blocked the nuclear deal that Zuma and Putin had crafted so carefully. In Ecuador, claims of corruption amplified by civil society and journalists were a major reason Correa didn't run for a new term. Environmental groups and political activists dogged Nord Stream 2 from the start. And in Ukraine, civil society was key to the Maidan revolution. Russia also underestimates the power of other nations, especially Western ones, which it likes to portray as dying societies. The Kremlin was surprised when Western countries mounted a powerful, winning influence campaign in Macedonia, when Denmark held up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline for 2 years, when Donald Trump, Putin's supposed friend, stopped Nord Stream 2 cold with sanctions in 2019, when NATO countries poured weapons into Ukraine. Russia can be outmaneuvered when others dare to take assertive action. The case studies also showed that Russia is routinely contemptuous of international organizations, independent regulators, and legal processes. And this often has a cost. With Sputnik, it tried to do an end run around drug regulators to the detriment of the drug's international acceptance. With Nord Stream 2, it ignored EU and German regulators, only to find it could not prevent them from raising serious obstacles to the pipeline. Neither Russia nor Zuma could control South Africa's courts. Putin now faces an indictment from the International Criminal Court that kept even friendly South Africa last year from inviting him to the BRICS summit. I also found that Russian influence suffers from conflicting goals. Russia's aggressive behavior in Europe and at home created great complications for the Nord Stream project, which Moscow had hoped to isolate from politics. With Sputnik, the Russian leadership's headlong rush for a first-in-the-world propaganda victory crippled the vaccine's scientific credibility. So these are some of the self-defeating elements that I found tend to recur across Russian influence operations. And the book includes others as well. So all these weaknesses suggest many tactics for Russian nations looking to resist Russian influence, countering Russians' focus on narrow elites by stepping up outreach to the broad citizenry of a country, ramping up civil society, strengthening independent journalism, judiciaries, regulators, spotlighting Russia's tendency to act only in its own narrow interest, being ready to recognize and exploit contradictions among Russian goals, and running public diplomacy operations based on true facts with the investment and skill that Russia brings to its own information warfare. So I think I'm going to stop here. The failings in Russian influence operations appear to me to be frequent and significant enough that they can create opportunities for astute statecraft by free societies. There's no magic bullet here. Russia is very, very skilled at its propaganda. But nonetheless, if one is looking for ways to try to reduce the power of Russian influence, as has been successfully done in the past, these are some of the things that I think policymakers can keep in mind. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent, for an excellent speech on today's theme, Russia and its influence operations. First of all, I want to mention that how greatly you've highlighted certain case studies like the conflict in Ukraine, South Africa, the Sputnik vaccine, Nord Stream 2, Macedonia conflict, and other significant events that shed light on Russia influence operations. Also, you've also talked about the common perception of Putin as a master tactician by highlighting instances of Russian influences, the operations that have resulted in the setbacks and defeats. Additionally, you've mentioned how Russia's miscalculations for the United States and other countries include increased geopolitical instability, economic disruption, and the potential for military conflict. So thank you so much for sharing your insights on this subject. Now let's take some questions. First question. How has Russia's use of disinformation and the propaganda impacted its ability to achieve its foreign policy objectives? And what strategies have been effective in countering these tactics?
Well, I think that the strategies are basically the ones that I laid out, countering Russia's focus on narrow elites, strengthening civil society, and so forth. Ramping up civil society, strengthening independent journalism, judiciaries, regulators. A lot of it is sort of information related, making sure that people are aware of Russia's tendency to act only in its own narrow interest, and bringing real investment and real skill to information efforts. I find that a lot of Russian arguments are actually rather sort of pathetically weak or contradictory, but so little attention is devoted by anyone, it seems, to pointing that out that they seem to win by default. I mean, just to give you one example, Russia basically is very busy in the global South trying to turn everybody against major Western countries. At the same time, in major Western countries, it is trying very hard through fear of immigrants and things like that to turn people against the global South. Now, this is, such an obvious contradiction and such obvious hypocrisy that you would think that someone would be pointing out to the global South what Russia is doing in West Europe, and that someone would be pointing out to people in West Europe what Russia is doing in the global South. Yet, this doesn't seem to happen.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. In what ways could Russia benefit from the recent uprising against Western influence in the Sahel region of Africa?
There are a number of benefits. I mean, obviously, one benefit is to seize control of resources in those countries. Another benefit is to humiliate France, which is the big loser in all of this. Another benefit is to spread some general panic that Russia's influence operations are irresistible, and that therefore irresistible, and therefore, they must, by definition, be about to take over all of Africa. So these are all benefits. And if you look at some of this through the perspective of my study, you would see several things. That in each of these countries, Russia has succeeded by ingratiating itself with a relatively small elite that is probably pretty fragile. In many cases, what those elites want most from Russia is protection of their own regimes. We can see how Russia's tactics with regard to these countries are based mainly on its own advantage, that is to say, extracting minerals. We can see, through the perspective of my work, that Russia really has nothing to offer these countries in terms of what really concerns them, which is prosperity. It offers no prescription for prosperity. Its main product, as in many of these case studies, is for the people of these countries, is simply to whip them up into an anti-Western furor, which will last a while. And then these regimes will fall. So is this a long-term Russian victory? I think it's very hard to say that at the moment. These countries will eventually, I think, start to think about their own advantages and basically how they are being colonized, essentially, is what's happening. And it may feel good now to be colonized by someone besides France, but eventually colonialization is colonialization.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. What role do economic factors play in Russia's foreign policy decisions? And how have sanctions impacted Russia's behavior on the global stage?
Economic factors are tremendously important in Russia's inability to run influence operations that actually benefit anyone. As I said, they are not able to do huge aid programs to win large support from populations because of the programs that they carry out. And this is a very serious problem for Russia, particularly because of sanctions. But the Russian economy has basically been headed down for quite a while. Under the Soviet Union, the United States and the Soviet Union during the height of the Soviet Union were pretty much almost equal in terms of GDP. Now Russian GDP is I don't know, somewhere around the level of Italy or Brazil. It's not a leading country at all in terms of its economy. And considering all the money it spends on war and things like that, it's not likely to recover to a greater position. It's heavily dependent at this point on a couple of countries. I would say China is one of them. India is another. If China and India were to exert pressure on Russia for one thing or another, I think Russia would have very little choice but to listen to that kind of pressure. Russia's just so dependent. So even though it can obviously export force in some narrow ways, and it can make a few people, as I said, a few people in a few countries rich. Economic weakness is a huge Russian source of weakness, and by some accounts, you could figure that that Russia is really fighting an economic last-ditch battle. I mean, this is Russia's last battle for prestige and influence and power internationally before it falls into the position of an economic colony of China.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. What is your opinion on this? That how can Russia build confidence and ensure the protection of the Central Asian region from potential misuse?
So how could Russia be able to gain confidence and thus secure the Central Asian region from being misused? I suppose so the question is, how can Russia build authority in Central Asia?
Yeah, how it can build the authority, and also how it can take charge of the Central Asian region.
Well, Russia has a real problem in Central Asia. It's primarily an economic problem. Again, an area where the economies of Central Asia were pretty much all sort of north-south connected between Central Asia and Russia. Now, with Russia's economic weakness, it doesn't have that much to offer Central Asia. From one side, we have the influence of Turkey, which is very powerful and has an ethnic kinship with Central Asia. And the other side, you have China. And so we have the construction of all these new trade routes from China through Central Asia, through Turkey to Europe, which are going to increase trade sort of horizontally under Russia, sort of a belt under Russia geographically that excludes Russia from all this trade. How Russia can build influence, I think that's a that's a problem for them. I suppose what they're trying to do is to build influence primarily militarily and in terms of security, trying to convince Central Asian governments, all of which have their own concerns about domestic security and remaining in power, that it can keep them in power. I guess it imagines a world in which China and Turkey provide the money and it provides the security for these countries. But ultimately, if these countries have strong relations with China and Turkey, why they would need Russia specifically for security, presumably these countries would be getting more prosperous and they would be able to provide for their own security. Their regimes would be able to provide for their own security. So I think Russia's short to medium term goal is just to provide security, mercenaries, whatever it takes to keep these governments in power. But I'm not sure that it's a very viable long-term strategy.
Thank you so much, Professor Ken. So this one is, I've read your book, and this is in relation to the book. Though you have explained it in it, but I would like you to answer this so that the audience can, get the meaning of it or get the answer of how it is actually like. So what do you think that how has Russia's relationship with authoritarian and conservative governments impacted its ability to achieve its foreign policy objectives? And what are the potential long-term implications of these alliances?
So it's alliances with authoritarian countries, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, Russia's trying to build an authoritarian international. Back in the day, there was the Communist International. So they're trying to create an alliance of countries around the world that are authoritarian, that do not respect basic political rights, and so forth. And they have been successful to some degree with it. These are in many cases not the kind of allies that you would want to have, because a lot of these countries are not particularly prosperous or useful. But if you look at the expansion of BRICS, for example, I think that's the idea, to sort of build an authoritarian collection of countries with large populations now. But these countries vary tremendously. The degree of democracy or authoritarianism in some of the BRICS members is different. I mean, they're not all the same. So it would be hard to say that that the BRICS countries could sort of create a constitution or create a comprehensive idea of how a country should be governed and what are the goals of government, because they're all different to varying degrees. Obviously, India and China are different, and Brazil. I mean, all these countries in terms of their political freedom and traditions are different. They do have one thing in common, and that is sort of well, I won't even say that. I was about to say that they all have in common a strong anti-colonialist ideology, but I'm not sure that that applies to Brazil, for example. So it's a very it's sort of a group of convenience from a number of countries at various times thought it was useful to join. You wonder how happy some of these countries are to be in it right now. Argentina is a particularly interesting example that now has a president who is quite wary of Russia and China. Will it actually wind up entering BRICS or not, even though it's supposed to as of January 1st? So so Russia can hope to create an authoritarian international, but the contradictions within it are fairly daunting. Russia's relationship to China is different from India's relationship to China, obviously, and there are many other strains within the alliance, including the degree to which they want to continue to have friendly relations with Western countries.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Similarly, can you also talk about the use of cyber attacks and other forms of digital warfare by Russia, and also how it has impacted its ability to achieve its objectives, the foreign policy objectives?
I'm sorry, what has impacted its foreign policy objectives?
I'm asking that can you highlight the use of cyber attacks and the other forms of digital warfare, and how it has impacted the ability to achieve the foreign policy objectives by Russia?
I think you have to divide cyber into two sections. If it's the question of using cyber for propaganda purposes, social networks and so forth, and websites and bots and things like that, and maybe to be reinforced by artificial intelligence at some point, then I think it's been fairly effective. They were very quick in understanding the power of social media, how to game the algorithms of Facebook, Twitter, and so forth to spread their messages. So I think in that sense, their commitment to electronic means of spreading information and disinformation have been quite skillful. In terms of what we think of traditionally as cyber, like cyber attacks and taking down a country's banking system or something like that, I think they've been less effective. Certainly, everybody's scared to death of them, and they can cause great inconvenience in different countries. But they've carried on cyber attacks against Ukraine for years, against the Baltic nations for years. It is annoying. It is expensive to try to deal with these attacks. But on the whole, I don't think they've had much impact on politics, on people's perceptions. Things are always going down anyhow in various countries for other reasons. So people are used to things being down for a few days for one reason or another. The place where it could actually make a difference, obviously, is in terms of some kind of full-blown conflict. If Russia and the West, for example, wind up in an actual war or in a pre-war situation in which they're using everything against each other, but but actual kinetic weapons. Russia could clearly deploy some things. I'm sure they have plans to try to cut communications among Western countries, to interfere with their crucial infrastructure and so forth. This is something that could happen. At the same time, I would note that Western countries are not unable to compete in this space. So I think that Russian infrastructure and a lot of other things regarding Russia could be targeted as well by Western countries. So it may well be that that neither side really wants to get into its ultimate cyber capabilities. One, because you don't know what the other side has, and you are afraid to show what you have, because then the other side can build countermeasures. So it may be, I mean, we talk about the worst kinds of cyber attacks. They might be to some degree in the category of nuclear attacks, and it's just too horrible to imagine, and you don't know how it might escalate. So you try to operate below the nuclear level.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question.
Do I see? Okay, I'm sorry. Let's see.
I'm
Right.
asking those questions only. Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine. So in what should we do, the Indian MEA?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
how might the recent trip of the Indian Minister of External Affairs to Russia influence the global politics? Like, can you talk about India-Russia relations, the future of India-Russia relations?
Sure. Not an area of great
Like your
expertise for
opinion,
me.
your opinion.
Yeah, sure. Well, my opinion is that India has a tremendous amount of power vis-a-vis Russia in the power equation. Russia needs India more than India needs Russia. India is a growing, powerful nation, now I believe the most populous in the world. It has a huge commercial interests everywhere in the world. It trades with everybody. It's a powerhouse. It has its problems, obviously, but India is a really, really important and powerful country, especially vis-a-vis Russia. When you consider that Russia, maybe 40% of Russia's oil exports now go to India, and Russia doesn't really have any other choices except China for its exports. So India has this huge authority vis-a-vis Russia. And I mean, obviously, I wasn't present at any of the India-Russia meetings, but I would have hoped that India would have gone in as the stronger party in these negotiations rather than the weaker one. And so for that reason, I think whatever India's agenda is, it's in a very good position to help bring that about. I would hope that India's agenda would include respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. And of course, I have Ukraine in mind. India is very concerned about sovereignty and territorial integrity vis-a-vis other countries, and rightly so. So I would think that India would be in a terrific position to be some kind of diplomatic interlocutor between Russia and Ukraine. I think it could be very powerful in this. Now, will India choose to do that or not? Where does it see its interests ultimately? That's a question for India. But I don't think India has ever been so powerful vis-a-vis Russia as it is now, and it's so influential in the world in general, all over, from Central Asia to Africa and all the other places. India is a big power, and for it to be, it seems to me, for India to be sort of neutral, if that's the situation vis-a-vis Ukraine, it seems odd. for a big power, which India is. I mean, a lot of sort of powers like India, emerging powerful countries in the world say, and they're not crazy, they're probably right, say, well, we should be in the UN Security Council. And maybe they should. But, if you're in the UN Security Council, you can't abstain from everything. I mean, you shouldn't. You can't be neutral on everything. I mean, if you want to be a big power, you should have some positions. And I hope that India will develop a clear position regarding Ukraine. It has the authority to do so.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. Can you identify any recurring trends in the Kremlin's past foreign policy setbacks that you believe might persist in the future?
I think that the trend that's emerging in Russian foreign policy is basically not to care about Russia's image. It's their foreign policy now is very results oriented, and their information policy as well. That is to say that their goal is not for everybody to love Russia. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, said in a recent interview that Russia is not squeaky clean. Russia is what it is, and the world has to live with it. So when people accuse Russia of torturing prisoners in Ukraine, torturing its own prisoners in its own prisons in Russia too, or war crimes of the kind that the ICC has decreed against Putin, the Russians, they deny it all, but they don't really devote a lot of attention to it. If you look at RT, the Russian television network, or other Russian, international information assets, they don't spend a lot of time talking about Russia and how great Russia is. It's basically all about how awful the West is. So they have basically decided that their image is not that important. The image that they really care about is scaring everybody to death, to be the Lord Voldemort of countries, and that they will get the most benefit by just intimidating people and looking like they're totally unmovable, and they cannot be affected by public opinion, either outside Russia or inside Russia, that they're going to do what they're going to do, and the world has to watch out, and that they're an unbeatable force. This is different, obviously, from the past. I mean, the Soviet Union, for example, spent a lot of time trying to tell people how wonderful the Soviet Union was, and how communism or socialism was the future of humanity. Russia doesn't bother with any of that these days. Its ideology is not outlooking. Its ideology is very inward-looking, sort of the czarist idea of autocracy and religion and nationalism. That's the ideology, and they're all internally related. So I think that's sort of the trend, to scare everybody to death. And some countries can be scared to death, but for a country with a declining economy that's basically dependent on two countries that has all the problems that it has, declining population, unstable internal situation, as you could see from the Prigozhin rebellion and other things. They are really punching above their weight. It's all basically based on propaganda and slogans and a kind of anti-colonialism that doesn't really have anything substantive behind it other than pure propaganda.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. So what is your opinion regarding Russia's warm water policy, as we have seen it during the Russia-Ukraine conflict? And why do you think warm water ports hold significance for Russian security?
Well, Russia's always been short of warm water ports, and it's created a real crisis for them in this case. The first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is the Baltic, that the Baltic has become essentially a NATO sea. They always had, neutral Finland and sort of neutral Sweden. I mean, Sweden, I think its heart was always with the NATO countries, but nonetheless, officially speaking, it was neutral. And so they've essentially lost the Baltic. They're now, it's possible for NATO, if it chooses to really bottle them up in the Baltic Sea. In the last couple decades, they lost the Adriatic Sea. They had, and they now have no ports that they can really access there. So we're left with, a Syrian port, and the very dicey situation with Turkey, which is dicey for everybody. And the West is having a lot of difficulty with Turkey, and Russia's having a lot of difficulty with Turkey. And so in that hemisphere, it's a major problem for them. I mean, they really need a warm water port if they want to have a credible world girdling navy. Now, they may decide that that's not really that important to them. I mean, maybe they should say that, well, we're never going to be able to defeat any navy. And so, the Western navies or the Chinese Navy or maybe the Indian Navy. So maybe we should give up on Navy and just, do missiles or something. But I think the outlook is not that good for them.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. So what do you think, how has Russia's engagement with energy resources, particularly in the context of projects like Nord Stream 2, influenced its geopolitical influence and relationships with other countries? And what are the potential implications for global energy dynamics?
I'm sorry, start that again, but just before Nord Stream 2.
Yeah. I want to say, how has Russia's engagement with energy resources, particularly in the context of projects like Nord Stream 2, have influenced its geopolitical influence and relationships with other countries? And what are the potential implications for global energy dynamics?
Well, I think that the energy dynamics have really been a huge surprise. I mean, who would have thought that Western Europe could rid itself of total dependency on Russian energy? I mean, obviously it hasn't completely. They're still importing Russian LNG and are dependent on that to some degree, but much less than ever before. So I think that Russia as a world energy power retains great potential, but it's now jeopardized by everything that it's doing now. One bright area technologically for Russia has been energy. It has done deals for nuclear power plants with all sorts of countries in Africa. Most of those deals had never started, but at least stuff was signed, and it seemed possible that Russia could be the big nuclear power plant power. It has the technology to enable many countries to exploit their natural gas resources and domestic oil resources. It recognized early on, I think, that hydrocarbons would not be the fuel of the future. Therefore, it pivoted very well toward nuclear power and being able to provide nuclear power plants, even though a lot of the world still will be using hydrocarbons for a long time. So it was the brightest part of Russian economic relations with the world. They really had something to give. But the Ukraine adventure has created a real difficulty for them. First of all, it's brought on all these sanctions. And second of all, what countries really want to deal with Russia now, either because it's not a good look to deal with a country that's engaged in the brutality that Russian forces are in Ukraine. Or, countries have to question how stable is Russia. Energy projects are long term. It takes years to bring them online. What will happen in Russia? People remember that after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had the Yeltsin period, and during the Yeltsin period, Russia really pulled back around the world, pulled back on its trade, pulled back on its aid, pulled back on its diplomatic and commercial operations. It sort of became kind of a hermit country for a while. Now, what happens after Putin? Will it become a hermit country again, at least for a while? And what does that mean to me if my country has made this long-term deal with Russia? So I'm afraid from Russia's standpoint that it's really killed a golden goose here, and it can continue to, export energy to some parts of the world and help some parts of the world with their energy projects, but it doesn't have anywhere near the power that it would have had if they had not gotten involved in this Ukrainian affair.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. How has Russia's use of covert and overt tactics, you've talked about this in your book also, such as information warfare and military interventions, influenced its ability to achieve its geopolitical objectives in specific case studies, which you have highlighted in your presentation also?
Right. Well, there's overt and there's covert, obviously, in information operations. I would say that on the whole, you have to be overt sooner or later, because everything gets discovered. If you talk about influence operations, we're talking about cognitive operations, which is say propaganda. Then if you go out on social networks with a certain line, then you eventually get exposed, because social networks are and the whole nature of how they work. It's very possible for experts in how they work to determine where the message originated, how it was spread, it went from one place to another, where did it come from originally. If something comes originally from a Russian source, it's usually possible to trace it back to a Russian source. But I think Russia's position is it just doesn't care. It doesn't care if a campaign was traced back to a Russian source. As long as it has some influence in a country, then it's not a problem. And so I think the value of covert activity is probably most useful in creating organizations that look like they are local in origin, but are actually controlled by Russian interests that are hard to identify, or in trying to simply bribe politicians or public figures in one way or another to promote the Russian line. So they've always had a covert and an overt element to their work, but I think that increasingly they're probably tending toward the overt, in the sense that they don't care what's discovered, and they have also managed to latch on to a number of sort of right-wing political movements in various countries that are sort of naturally favorable to Russia. So it doesn't require so much covert work if a political party and a right-wing political party in West Europe, for example, is friendly to Russia, then they can quite overtly back that party. They don't need to do it in some secret way, because the party itself is sort of proud of the fact that that they support Russia. Why they do is another matter, because it's possible to be right wing and also anti Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example. You look at Milei, for example, in Argentina. His government is by many measures right wing or extremely conservative. Yet on the other hand, he has a very negative view of Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I don't think that right wing necessarily means pro-Russia, but a number of right-wing movements and countries have somehow felt some solidarity with Russia's invasion of Ukraine that is kind of hard to understand.
Thank you so much, Professor.
I think I went off topic there, but
yeah, but you got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Next question. So, in your opinion, are there any specific areas where collaboration between Russia and the West remains feasible, notwithstanding the existing tensions? If yes, which domains hold the greatest potential for such cooperation?
Well, there are some areas for potential cooperation, but there's sort of two problems with it. One problem is that a lot of the cooperation might be more beneficial to Russia than it would be to the West. And the other is, do Western countries have any taste for friendly relations and photos of people shaking hands when Russia is devastating Ukraine? I can't think of a lot of Western universities or corporations that would be delighted to be up on some stage with Russians, drinking vodka and pledging, eternal cooperation. I think Russia would like that very much, but there's not much of a taste for that. But probably the larger question is, if you're thinking of areas of cooperation, what does Russia have that would be of use to the West? And I think a lot of Russia's, really good stuff is probably in the military realm. Some of their space competencies, so their, hypersonic missiles, various kinds of military things. I mean, this is where they devoted their science recently, and these are obviously not areas that they're going to share with anybody. But if you were to put Russian non-military science up against, say, Indian science, or West European science or American science, I don't think there would be a lot where Russia could really contribute much. So so there's this political barrier to cooperation, but probably more important, a practical barrier. I mean, what are we really going to get that we need? There may be some specific areas, maybe in energy or something where Russia has something, but they make a nice Kalashnikov. But I'm just not sure that there are great fields for cooperation of the kind that actually existed during the Soviet Union.
Thank you so much, Professor Kent. Next question. How have Russia's interaction with regional powers such as Turkey and China influenced its geopolitical strategies and its ability to shape regional dynamics in areas like Central Asia and the Caucasus?
Well, Russia is really, really dependent, I think, on other countries now, on regional powers to survive in some of these areas. I mean, if if Turkey, for example, were able to really provide security for countries in Central Asia, which it could, but has not focused on for the time being, then Russia might be completely out of the game or completely dependent on some kind of cooperation with these countries. Now, India does cooperate with Russia. Turkey does cooperate with Russia in some areas. So, okay, maybe they can work out some kind of a condominium in Central Asia. But that would be, I think, because India or Turkey felt like cooperating, and that's an area where Russia faces disadvantage. They do have one advantage still in Central Asia and in the Caucasus, and that is energy. And they are providing energy to these places, and it's not easily replaced. But which is fine. These countries can buy energy from Russia, but whether they are still capable of converting that into total geopolitical dominance is less clear than it was before.
So, as we draw this insightful session to close, I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to Professor Thomas Kent for his expert analysis and thought-provoking discussion on a topic, Russia and its influence operations, with special mention of his book. Today, we delved into the intricacies of Russia's influence operations and the far-reaching implications on global politics, information warfare, and democracy. Thank you for providing us with a thought-provoking exploration of Russia's geopolitical endeavors and valuable insights for policymakers, analysts, and anyone interested in understanding the complexities of Russia's global influence. We had a very detailed discussion, and we covered various aspects of Russia's influence operations, including their tactics, targets, and potential countermeasures. Thank you once again, Professor Kent. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great evening, everyone, and have a good day, Professor Kent. Take care.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.